Hello and welcome to the Stormont Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Stormont and inside policymaking for Northern Ireland. I'm David McCann, and also on the podcast is Tim Cairns, former special advisor to First Minister Peter Robinson. Hello, Tim.
Hello, David.
And we also have Michael McKernan, who was a former special advisor to the SDLP. Hello, Michael.
Hello, David. Hello, Tim.
And I'm going to say hello to Michael today, and then we're going to have a bonus podcast tomorrow. I'm not going to say hello to him tomorrow.
Okay,
well, you're forgiven already in advance.
On the podcast today, we'll have more details for you about that bonus podcast a little bit later. On the podcast today, we are looking at the issue that has been dominating politics in Northern Ireland this week. Paul Givan, the Education Minister's visit to Israel. The Minister was bullish in defending himself this week and will face a no confidence motion in the Assembly on Monday. We will be talking to the Minister in this episode of the podcast and reflecting on the stability of the executive going forward. Then we'll have some analysis about, are we facing another potential collapse? All that and more coming up on this edition of Stormont Sources. And we're now joined by the Minister of Education, Paul Givan, the man at the centre of all the political controversy over the past week. Paul, you're very welcome to Stormont Sources.
David, very welcome. Thank you for allowing me to join with Michael and with Tim, and look forward to the next half hour or so.
Okay, Paul, look, the trip to Israel, as I was saying in the intro, you were invited to this, just to get a couple of clarifications out there, it was funded by the Israeli government, yeah?
It was, yes. So the invite came in from the Israeli embassy in London. That's when the invitation, it came from them.
And there's a bit of confusion, okay, about in which capacity you were invited on, because, and I think, Paul, you've kind of fueled a bit of this, because I think you said something slightly different to two different BBC hosts between Talkback and Nolan. So just for clarification on this, were you there as the Minister of Education, or were you there as Paul Givan MLA for Lagan Valley?
So it was both, and that is actually what I said to William Crawley when the interview aired. As I was in Jerusalem, I indicated, invited by the Israeli embassy at no cost to the taxpayer. It was fully funded, and obviously I'll make the relevant declaration through the normal process in due course. But in as part of that delegation, when I responded to the invitation, I indicated that given my role as Education Minister, if they could facilitate an education component part of that visit, that would be something that I would welcome. And so whenever we had got to Israel, then they indicated, yes, there was a school that they had organised to visit. And that obviously interfaces with my role as Education Minister, and therefore the department put out a press release, social media clips, reflecting that aspect of the visit. I was very careful to avoid the department obviously putting out anything to do with the other aspects of the trip, which, I'm comfortable with, but I recognise, I was there as part of a wider delegation, and therefore the department only provided me support in respect of the education component part.
And looking at the trouble, because this seems to be where your critics, and I know you reject their criticism, but this seems to be where your critics have really zeroed in on, is the press release from the department. Considering the trouble this has caused, and we'll unpack a little bit of it in more detail in a bit, but considering the trouble this has caused, would you not have just sat back and thought, what? Did you not think that, shake your head and go, God, I really wish I hadn't done that now in retrospect? I really wish, for the sake of the tweet and the press statement, I really wish I hadn't done that.
Well, I think everyone, will always look back with the benefit of hindsight, and, you always reflect on decisions that you've taken. And I, of course, I have reflected on that and thought, would I do this again? And then I go back to the fundamentals. Did I do anything wrong? And the conclusion I reach on that is, no, I didn't. And I also conclude that the role of the department in this, there was nothing wrong with that. And therefore, that would be me to say, because of the reaction, because other people have got an opinion, and I think some of that has been fueled with a bit of an internal competition within the left as to who can be the most vociferous. That would be me taking decisions on the basis of, I believe, unfounded criticism. I accept that there can be criticism of the visit, but there is not a rational criticism for the way in which I navigated this from my departmental perspective. So no would be the answer to that. And, I do think it's interesting that, my statement, and if people read it, there is nothing political in it at all. You literally could have lifted OFEC school in Jerusalem and replaced it with any school in Lisbon, and it would have had the same content. But it's because it was in Jerusalem and it was in Israel that then there has been this reaction. And I contrast my statement and I look at the Minister for the Economy, who produced a report and used departmental resources and through an urgent through a written ministerial statement, references genocide having been committed by Israel and how Israel and Invest NI should not be used. Now, we've called that into the executive because it's politically controversial. She also put that out on her departmental website. There was a press release. Where's the questions about the impartiality when it comes to the civil servants within that department? And I haven't heard those questions. Now, my colleague Philip Brett has raised that with the head of the civil service. We are raising that. I don't think it's got any publicity around it. But my non-political statement stands in stark contrast to a very political statement and departmental resources that were used by the Department for the Economy. And so I think that's an interesting kind of contrast for people just to consider then why the reaction to me, but not this reaction about the independent impartiality of the civil service in another department.
And you were mentioning, another thing I want to get clarity on is you mentioned in your statement in the Assembly on Monday that your permanent secretary has looked into this and given you a clean bill of health. Will we get a publication of that? I don't know whether you call it an investigation, but report, whatever. Will we see that? Will that be made publicly available?
Well, so listen, that'll be something that I'm sure the department will have to consider. I engaged with the permanent secretary before I went into the assembly. There'd already been some work to review the trip and the engagement around the department. And as I had met with him, the conclusion that he had reached was that things were appropriate. That's being finalised, and obviously that's something that I know the Education Committee, again, an interesting point that we're dealing with. A wide range of educational challenges on special educational needs, financial pressures, and they've asked the permanent secretary come up to the committee to talk about something which didn't cost the taxpayer anything. So I suspect those questions will continue to be asked, perfectly legitimate if people want to ask them. But how the department, it's the permanent secretary who is ultimately responsible for the administrative side of the department. I, under law, am the head of that department. There's well-established parameters around how a department acts under the direction and control of a minister, but he is the accounting officer.
But you have no issue if he did turn around and say, "Minister, I'm putting this out." You would have no issue with that.
It isn't a conversation yet that I've had with the permanent secretary as to how he wants to handle the work that he has concluded. But I'm relaxed about this because what he has told me, I'm comfortable with in terms of the process that's been followed. But it isn't something yet that I've had a conversation with him. But I'm entirely relaxed about where this ends up in the public domain.
Okay, Michael.
Well, where would I start? I'm actually not interested in the isolation of you, Paul, on this issue, or the departmental resources, or the vote of confidence, or what the economy minister did that was similar, or whatever. I think all of that stuff can be washed out in the assembly and in public debate and all of that. My only issue is simply that you have this regime that's been found to have committed genocide. You have, after the appalling events, admittedly, of October the 7th, but they had Hamas militarily beaten after a few months, but they went on for 2 years, raining down death on innocent, defenseless people, targeting children, killing reporters, using starvation, all of that. And then some elected representatives, including yourself, decided that it'd be nice to accept an invitation from this murderous regime to go and give them a propaganda boost. Now, I just disagree with that. There's no point really in debate. I just disagree with it. But obviously, you're okay with that, and you do actually support the Israeli regime.
Well, I think in how you frame it, no, I'm not content with the way in which you have characterised Israel. So, I'm not going to agree with that characterisation of Israel. Do I believe that there has been innocent lives lost in Gaza? Yes, I do. And do I think that's terrible? Of course, I think that is terrible. There were innocent lives lost during many conflicts. The Second World War, there were innocent lives lost in the Allied forces, but also whenever the Allied forces were in Germany as a way that they had to defeat the Nazi regime. Unfortunately, there were innocent Germans who lost their lives. And when I look at what's happened in Gaza, and having been there and witnessed for myself the trauma that's been inflicted on the Israeli people, there's been trauma inflicted on the people of Gaza, but the genesis of the problems, in my view, and this is one that can be debated, is that you have a terrorist organisation in Hamas who have weaponized the Gaza Strip. They're not just a terrorist organisation. They are the political infrastructure in Gaza. They run the hospitals. They run the schools. They run the social welfare system. They are embedded in the very intimate fabric.
But do you think the Israeli response has been proportionate? And for example, if it went on for another year more of the same, you think it was okay?
No, again, the debate around the proportionality of it, I think, is a very valid one to have. But when we look at what happened with Gaza, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. Not only did they withdraw their settlers, they actually dug up their dead. They lifted their dead Jewish people out of Gaza, handed it over entirely to the Palestinian people. Hamas took control. They've received international aid from around the world, including from Israel. And what did Hamas do? They invested that in terrorist infrastructure, tunnels, built underneath schools, built underneath hospitals. It wasn't invested in the good of the people. And yet the question here is, should Israel then have not responded on the 7th of October? Because the people I spoke to say they expected...
I don't think anybody disagrees that they shouldn't have responded. They had every right to respond and to try and defeat Hamas militarily.
And I think that's an important distinction, Michael.
Just bombardment of defenceless people.
Well, I think that is a significant point to make, because if we accept Israel had the right to respond, then that does take you into a place of the proportionality of it. Whenever we met with people in Israel and Israeli officials in the Ministry of Affairs, they said that it has taken 2 years to process through their military operations because they had over 200 hostages in Gaza. So not only whenever they said that there were operations being planned and they identified if there were innocent civilians in a vicinity, they would have cancelled. Now, this is what they would say. People who dispute this, but they said just they would have cancelled their operations because they didn't want civilian life being lost. They made areas aware when they were moving in order for civilian population to have an opportunity.
They didn't let any journalists see what was going on.
And again, we can debate that, but they warned the civilian population. That's why you had the mass exodus of thousands of civilians out of areas before they moved in. But they also made the point that they had over 200 hostages. They didn't want to go into areas that could have resulted not only in the killing of some of the innocent civilians in Gaza, but they didn't want to kill their own Israeli people. And therefore, they prosecuted this military operation in a much more slower process that they said quite candidly, and again, this can create a reaction, that if they hadn't have any hostages in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, they wouldn't have taken anywhere near as long to have conducted their military operations. So I think we need to just look through, the eyes sometimes, yes, of the people in Gaza, but also people in Israel. And when I met with those people in the border areas in southern Israel, and then in the northern areas where Hezbollah have been operating for years, certainly in the southern part, they didn't anticipate a land invasion or a sea invasion. All their preparations were for the continued sporadic rocket attacks, and the Iron Dome was always a very effective means of dealing with that. They were not prepared, and that's where there's a fair degree of anger within the Israeli population towards their own military, that they weren't prepared for a land invasion. And that's why they've said 7th of October has fundamentally changed the way in which they view the Gaza area operating in the future.
Because Israel is now saying no, whatever about the Trump deal and the peace agreement, such as it is, Israel is now saying no to a two-state solution. Would that be your position?
Well, I believe in a two-state solution, but I think whenever it's too easy for me to then say, yes, I believe in a two-state solution, and I've heard other people say that. What does a two-state solution look like? What if you have a two-state solution? Does the Palestinian state recognize the state of Israel? Because Hamas have never recognized Israel's right to exist. And so whenever I pose that question to politicians that I met in Israel, why can't you have a two-state solution? Because we did ask them about humanitarian aid. We did ask them about how they're going to find ways to end this conflict. One of the responses came back to me was that very question that I'm asking, that you want us to provide a two-state solution, but a two-state solution to a neighbouring country or entity who doesn't want us to exist. And that's why the ceasefire deal, they have been very clear, and it's in that 20-point plan. Hamas can have no part in either retaining its weapons or in any part of the administrative functions of the Gaza Strip, given the way in which they operated over the last 15 years. And I don't think that's an unreasonable position for them to take. And therefore, the challenge is going to be, how effective will be the Trump-led peace plan? And if Tony Blair is involved, I'll have my suspicions as to how he deals with the terrorists, given my experience in Northern Ireland. How do they hold to account the element of the deal around Hamas? And who's actually putting boots on the ground? Is there going to be an international peacekeeping force from the European allies, from America? Are they actually going to put soldiers into Gaza who can then deal with Hamas, so that it's not the Israeli Defence Force that's doing?
We don't know what's going to happen there. But tell me, do you think Robbie Butler and Doug Beattie were right to turn down the invitation?
Listen, I think they've said what they've said. I can answer for why I was there. I think Steve Aiken has answered very effectively why he was there. Again, notable.
And this was pure belief in what you were doing, and not in any way a poke in the eye for all the people who are backing Palestine and so on.
No. Listen, we've had our politics in Northern Ireland where people like to poke each other in the eye, and we know where that gets us. I have listened for months a campaign around the BDS, boycott Israel, and the people have talked about genocide being committed by Israel, and it has now taken up a lot of political discourse in local councils within the assembly. I genuinely wanted to be informed. I'd never been to Israel before. Do we inform ourselves through talking points that are produced by those who are pro-Palestinian or those who are pro-Israel, or if the opportunity presents, to go and hear firsthand? And I think it's interesting that other politicians, Mary Lou McDonald, went to the West Bank, met with Hamas. Multiple politicians, Colm Eastwood recently in Beirut, meeting with different organisations, and there's a litany of politicians, not just in Northern Ireland, but only in January of this year, you had a European network that represented over double figures in terms of European parliamentarians who went to Israel. Sinn Féin have wanted to send some representatives recently into Israel, but weren't allowed access.
To the Palestinian side, I mean, you go to the Israeli side, there's nobody really getting an independent view
it's just
of the conflict.
But Michael, it's the double standards. It's okay for Sinn Féin and representatives to go and listen to the Palestinian Authority and to then meet with Hamas, and we have all of the evidence that shows when Pat Sheehan was in the area and he met with Hamas. That's okay, but a delegation goes and actually tries to get their own experience in Israel. That's the problem I have around the double standards.
But I think for many people, the Israeli regime is almost as
Michael,
as Hamas.
We've spent a long time talking about the Israeli regime. What about the Chinese government and the genocide they're committing? What about Myanmar and the genocide they've committed? What about Sudan, the genocide that's committed?
Are they raining down bombs and leaving thousands of children dying in rubble?
Well, they're doing much worse than that. That's certainly in China, and they've done much worse than that in Myanmar as well. And Sudan. But they are. But
I don't think that's accurate. But I want to move on. I wanted to say.
But I mean, sorry, I can't let this go because that is accurate. And what is it about nationalism in Northern Ireland.
Who are the
only
Chinese?
one-
Who are the children that the Chinese are bombing from the
murdered,
sky
they've
and turning
murdered
their communities
they've
into
murdered
rubble?
over 1 million Turkish immigrants. The Uyghur people are being completely wiped off
No,
the face of the earth, and they're in concentration camps. Anybody who's still
No,
alive.
yes, they're
So-
persecuting them.
No, but no. It's a genocide, Michael. It is a genocide against
it's not
the
a
Turkish
genocide.
populace. But well, here's
Now,
exactly
that's,
this.
Tim, that's a
but this
red
is-
herring. That's a
No,
distraction.
it's not a red herring. And here's the problem. What is it? And this is a question for you two guys. What is it about this genocide that exercises Irish nationalism, where you don't get exercise about Sudan, you don't get exercise about Ethiopia, you dispute there's a genocide in China when there is no dispute internationally on that? What is it about this genocide?
Well, you see, I don't think you can brand, as you so often do, you put all nationalists in the one bucket as if they all care about this and none of them care about that. I care about Sudan and I care about Gaza. And I'm reasonably even-handed about it. But you can't go into denial. It flummoxes me how in Northern Ireland, when we address the same factual matrix, we end up on opposite sides on something like the Gaza conflict, where it's plainly, plain that what Israel's been doing, at least for the past year, is just wrong.
I do find it strange, though, that very point that you're making, where you have nationalists lining up on one side along with the Alliance Party. There is a very clear left wing led by Jerry Carroll opposition to all of this, and the Alliance are now being led by them, which is an interesting one for where they're going as a political party. But it is a strange
we'll
one.
welcome them, the Alliance Party, as left wing nationalists.
I'm sure you do, Michael. I'm sure you do. It's being noticed within the unionist community very easily.
I've got just before we move on.
But the broader point, and I appreciate, because Michael and Tim will be able to jump in and have a good go at each other whenever I drop off the call. But we haven't been able to point out here as well the commentary around Israel and genocide and apartheid regime. What I witnessed in the only democracy in the Middle East, let's just remind ourselves.
It's a quasi-democracy.
Well, Michael, I was in the Knesset.
And it is an apartheid state.
Okay, so again, it is the only democracy. They're having elections. There'll be an opportunity for people to get rid of the Prime Minister in Israel next year. And they're having elections. When was the last election in the Palestinian Authority, in the Gaza Strip, in its neighbouring countries of Egypt, Jordan, Syria,
but I'm not defending
Lebanon.
Those totalitarian regimes or undemocratic regimes.
So I'm just asking for some perspective.
We're looking at Israel who claims
to
be setting these democratic standards, and they're behaving like despots.
So the 10
and
million...
it's the United Nations is accusing them of genocide. Yes. And it's the International Court that's accusing Netanyahu of being a war criminal. It's not just a bunch of lefties in Belfast.
So it's 10 million of a population of which there are 2 million Arabs. Okay, and that is reflected in the democratic process as well. And whenever I was there...
No, it's not. There's 10 Arabs in the Knesset.
Okay, so it's reflective of the workings of a democratic vote. So the point that I'm trying to make, and I know, Michael, I watched the podcast last week. You're very exercised about this, but if I can have an opportunity to finish this point, I was
entirely from a human rights point of view.
Okay, so listen, on the human rights point of view, the United Nations have found China guilty of genocide on the Uyghur community. 1 million Uyghurs, and they're in forced labour camps. They're harvesting their organs. There's cultural erasure. There is a genocide in China. I know you've disputed that. People can fact check it after this podcast.
Well, I haven't heard the UN saying it or anybody, but there is undoubted persecution of the Uyghurs in
there's
China,
a genocide, and I just point out again it's interesting the inconsistency on that point. But in northern Israel, I was with the Druze community, and it's not Jews because it's the Druze. There's 2 million Druze in the world. They believe in reincarnation, but they are a sect of the Shiite and Muslim faith from many hundreds of years ago. Okay. When I was there, again, the Druze in that part of northern Israel would not have been sympathetic towards the Israeli regime. When I met the uncle of a nephew who was one of 12 children playing football and a Hezbollah rocket landed on their football pitch, he said, we support Israel because Hezbollah, part of the Shia Muslim community of which they are a sect of many years ago, didn't distinguish between the Druze and the Jews. They see them as Israelis. And I asked them, how do you feel as a Druze, as a minority community in Israel? And they says, well, we're respected. We can practice our faith. Now they are actively joining the military because they see Israel as their only protection. And I thought that was an interesting takeaway, but you don't hear that being reflected in the media. And they also made the point that when the rocket attack was first reported by the BBC reported that rocket as having been a failure of the Iron Dome, and it wasn't. It was a Hezbollah rocket, and they were very critical of the international media and how they report what's happening in Israel. And I think that has to inform how we think about things. We need to fact check what comes through from the media.
We get totally bogged down in the detail of this.
Yeah.
Sorry, David, do you want to say something?
Well, I just want to come back. I want to come back to where we were at the start because we need to get on the integrated education and all of that as well. And we're almost running out of time. It does seem to me that unionists are being held to a different standard in this than what nationalists and Sinn Féin are.
There you go again, broad brushing.
That's what you said, Paul, at the start, and I agree with that. I suppose the question is, why is that? Why do you think that what Sinn Féin did in relation to Israel is not being held to the same standard that you're being held to by the media in terms of what's happened over the last week?
Well, I think it is a pretty important question that we need to just consider why, there isn't the same focus whenever I point out Sinn Féin. They're okay to talk about Israeli genocide and use departmental resources to pursue a highly political approach, and there is a question around it. And I think what I have witnessed, and certainly over the past 7 days, the reaction from predominantly those within the unionist community, not exclusively, but predominantly within the unionist community, has been enough is enough. We have had a peace process that led us up to 1998. In fact, before it, we had the Hume Adams talks when the SDLP started to sanitise the IRA when they were still actively engaged.
Explain, enough is enough of what?
Well, I'll get to let me just get to the context that there was a sanitization process for what is unacceptable in any democratic normal society. Hume Adams talks, the Downing Street Declaration, the peace process, the Belfast Agreement, that then we had to have Sinn Féin in government. They still hadn't carried out their decommissioning. They still hadn't signed up to policing and justice and recognising the PSNI in the courts. And all of that was that has to be accepted. We have to tolerate this in pursuit of
the flag
peace.
Coming down from Belfast City Hall,
let's
Northern
allow
Ireland
prisoners to be
Protocol,
released.
the Windsor Framework.
Michael, let him answer.
And then you go from the Belfast Agreement, and then we get to St Andrews, which was obviously the fundamental change for me and my party, because Sinn Féin were forced to support policing and the rule of law. And again, would you in a normal democratic society have us working with Sinn Féin? No, you wouldn't. But all of that was deemed to be something that you had to do for the greater good. Now we get to the point where nationalism, with Sinn Féin as the largest party, they no longer talk about a co-First Minister, a joint First Minister. It's First Minister and Deputy First Minister, a clear recognition of the symbolic difference between those two posts. But we talked about there having to be consensus. Now I hear Democratic majority votes in Belfast City Council. The Democratic majority vote in Derry and Strabane has to be reflected. And unionism has got to the point now where they have felt there is this rising attitude of, nationalism more broadly wanting to then dominate the unionist minority as it is with the alliance now not being with us. And I think the response to me is the outworkings of that approach. And I have to say, and people may say, oh, well, you would say this. I have never had the response that I have had from my constituency within the last 72 hours that I have had in terms of support, and from not just those that you would say this is loyalism and they'll respond, of course, because you're putting it up to Sinn Féin. It covers a very broad middle class perspective as well. And I think that's symptomatic of how
Paul,
unionists feel the way nationalists are operating, and the Republic of Ireland with the election of Catherine Connolly. Don't dismiss the impact that also will have on unionists' views in terms of the Republic of Ireland.
Well, Paul, I just want to bring it back home then. So obviously there's been talk about a potential of a collapse. We're only 18 months in, and we're already talking about the next collapse. And again, there's been talk about the poor relations between, and we've talked about it on here, about the poor relations between the DP Sinn Féin, not just DP Sinn Féin, but the Alliance Party as well. There seems to be poor relations. In terms of a collapse, How close are we, do you think, to I mean, are relations as bad as they look on the surface? I mean, Kate Nicholl was referencing kind of the toxicity that exists in Stormont, and you were like a bull in the china shop on Monday in the chamber. I mean, relations seem bad. Is that a fair
Well,
reflection?
I think I give a robust account of myself, as I would say it. And listen,
As per usual.
and I think, Michael could testify that, in the 1998 assemblies, what happened on Monday in Stormont was tame in comparison to the kind of exchanges that have happened in the past. So does it help relationships? No, it doesn't. I'm not going to say that this is conducive to positive relationships between the DUP and Sinn Féin. How could it be? But does it mean I believe that the institutions are going to collapse? No, I don't. But that again is an answer that if Sinn Féin, want to take the next step, well, then Michelle O'Neill will have to resign as First Minister, because that's the only way eventually that she would remove me from office. And then that begs the question, though, why go through this process, a motion, which I believe it is just because they don't want to be outflanked by Jerry Carroll, by the way. I think had he not laid this notice of motion, I'm not so sure Sinn Féin would have then laid a motion themselves, but they don't want to risk being outflanked by the left. But they will go through this vote of no confidence. They know that under the relevant legislation, it's an automatic cross-community vote, and therefore it's negative, it can't be passed. But even if it could be passed, then it's up to Gavin Robinson if he's going to remove me and then replace me with someone else.
Paul,
So we know it won't
work.
So why do it then, Michael?
Because
Because we can now bring forward notices of motions, no confidence in Liz Kimmins because of what she's done at Grand Central Station, not referring it to the executive. We'll likely get a court judgment. We could do it on Keith Archibald because of what she's done in the Department of Economy when it comes to investing in Israel. And indeed, there are other ministers who have taken actions which we find things that aren't appropriate. So are we now going to, put all these notice of motions forward and all these various different ministers? To what end? And therefore, that does beg the question: why go through the semantics
it's all
of this
going
process?
nowhere. But what I want to come back to is you're saying that you've never had the feeling before, with so many people coming up to you, they've simply had enough. And I asked you to say what all of that was, and it's this rise of aggressive or assertive nationalism or whatever. But I have to put it to you that you guys have been causing that systematically. And I asked you the question earlier, was the visit to Israel, was there a poke you in the eye element to it, to all the lefties or all the people who support Palestine? You said no. But think of this. Here's what the DUP's been doing with nationalists for, this aggressive, uncompromising, poke-in-the-eye politics, which is probably aimed at just recovering TUV votes, if truth be told. But it's things like Rebels and Renegades and Arlene Foster's Crocodiles and Gregory Campbell's Curry My Yogurt, and even recently your leader put something out about the Soldier F thing and included a big emblem of the parachute regiment. No, darned rightly how that will go down. And even when it comes to policy change, and I think Brexit has animated the United Ireland movement and brought it to the fore again. But the Brexit we've got, the unsatisfactory Brexit we've got, again, it was a result of the DUP holding out for the hardline Brexit and ending up with the border in the Irish Sea, where they could have had a Brexit with no border in the Irish Sea. And abortion, we've got the most liberal abortion laws anywhere because the DUP was absolute against that. Similarly, Irish language, the DUP disrespects the Irish language. There's people running in their droves going to night classes in Irish. My overall point is, and maybe Robbie Butler ticked this with me the other day, my overall point is that this aggressive pokey in the eye stuff, trashing your opponents all the time, is not the right approach. It may get you some TUV votes back, but it's not going to win you over the stubborn 12% who follow the Ulster Unionists. And when I put Robbie Butler over that, we had mistakenly believed that this was 12% for Liberal unions, and we said, no, we're not liberal. We're as staunch as anybody on the union, but we have more of a social conscience. And then I thought, right enough, he turned down the invitation. They've done other things that show, I mean, they were against Brexit.
Michael,
they've done other things that show that this hardline approach isn't necessarily the winning one looking to the future.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that, and I'm gonna let Tim unpack that whenever I go, because I don't agree at all with the narrative that Michael you've just painted. That is not the case, and yet no self-reflection on the way in which nationalism has been conducting itself over the past number of years. And I think nationalism needs to ask itself the question that if they're trying to convince unionists about a shared Northern Ireland and a new Ireland, and yet their conduct and behaviour is entirely the opposite of that. No more consensus politics, majority rule, no alternative to the paramilitary actions of the IRA, no tolerance for the British Army up in Derry and Strabane at a fair. I think if the intolerance that's coming through towards the unionist community isn't being understood by nationalism, then if they don't take this as a reset moment, then you're going to get more of this kind of confrontation coming from unionists. And I hope people will reflect and see the reaction from within the unionist community, because ultimately, what do I want? I want an executive that works. I want a devolved government. I don't believe in direct rule. I don't want to be ran by London. I want to have our own institutions doing that. But that can only happen in genuine partnership. And we're not seeing a genuine commitment to partnership and power sharing from nationalism. And that is something that they need to reflect on.
Just two final questions, Paul, before I let you go. I know you need to shoot on. But first question is, so you're talking about an executive that works. That kind of implies that we don't have an executive that's working at the minute. I mean, I've heard all the issues. I mean, you would think Northern Ireland is doing really, really well. At the minute, we don't have a healthcare crisis. We don't have schools crumbling around us, and we're debating these issues. So do we have an executive that works? One. And finally, the odds of the executive making it to May 2027 out of 10, what would you give it, in terms of 10 being definitely we'll make it to May and 1 being we're going to have a collapse?
Well, we're not going to collapse the institutions, okay? So, those are questions for others, if that's the space that they want to move into. Does it work? It could work better. But again, whenever we have these kind of debates, I get that it's difficult to get then the positive messages out. I can only give an answer for what my department is doing. I look at the childcare and the subsidy scheme that we've developed. I've led on all of that and got support from the executive to fund it, but all of the initiative has came from me in terms of that funding mechanisms. I look at the work in terms of some of the capital bills, and it's challenging on special educational needs and the placements. But we have created over 3,000 new places, difficult as that has been, but we have had to really push the education system to provide those placements. We need to move, though, from a reaction to a proactive, and that's why I've developed a 10-year strategic plan on capital bills for special educational needs. And then within the teaching profession, we are developing, I think, what will be a really transformative piece of work across curriculum, the assessment processes, teacher professional learning in terms of supporting them. And that is to help drive up educational underachievement and close the attainment gap between particularly those in more deprived communities compared to those that have got more advantage. Mm-hmm. And that transform ed piece is a really important piece of work, which, despite all of the noise and distraction, I've had meetings with my officials yesterday around where are we in terms of the process, around curriculum review, around the qualifications, around the assessment processes, teacher workload. There's a report in draft form now, nearly completed. And I'll take that forward. And of course, public industrial relations. So despite the trade unions, being highly political, I'll still work with them in the interests of teachers, and I hope that we can make progress in terms of their pay increases.
We need to get you back, Paul, to talk about transformation. I have a whole load of questions here, we didn't get to them. Integrated education. The one thing I have to say, just before we let you go, I'm really disappointed when your statement came out on the integrated education judgment that you only criticised those people who who'd been proven wrong by the judgment. Those of us who are right on this podcast and got the legal judgment pretty much nailed on. Right. I was looking for a paragraph for me, Paul, to say, Stormont Sources, Tim Cairns got it right.
You two can pat yourselves on the back. You can pat yourselves on the back.
But a poke in the eye for everybody involved.
Well, we need to get integrated education and on the transform education.
And to conclude on that point, I do find it interesting that for weeks I took a barrage from political opponents around the initial decision, and yet I had the temerity to point out how they were wrong in a ministerial statement, and yet there's criticism, that was deemed to be a poke in the eye for
But you
people.
could have been
And this is the point,
magnanimous
Michael.
in victory.
You can't have a double standards where I have alliance representatives, Sinn Féin, SDLP, People Before Profit, are very hostile and critical of me on media outlets, and yet whenever I respond, it's as though I'm meant to just lay down and take it.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a strange position that people think a minister should have. And so I highlighted in that statement the inaccuracies, not based on me. I didn't fact check them according to Paul Givan. I actually fact checked them according to the judge. So I think
Maybe
it's an
they
interesting.
Maybe they just listen to our episodes of Stormont Sources because we call it right.
I want to do justice, and also
And you're
want to
absolutely
end,
right. Absolutely right to come
I
back
also
to your
want to end.
apology.
I also want to end the backslapping between you and Paul here. Look, Paul, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast, and look, we do need to get you back on the other things, and knee pads and elbow pads for the no confidence motion debate on Monday. So looking forward to that.
Is that that's probably just for those that are having to bring this motion forward? I'll certainly not need them.
Lots more to come from Tim and Michael. We'll be debating the interview we just had with Paul Givan, and are we looking at a potential collapse on the cards? Remember, if you'd like to watch the podcast, head to YouTube and search for Stormont Sources. Press subscribe. Thank you. We hit over 1,000 subscribers last week, so thank you so much for subscribing. If you haven't done it already, make sure you do. Watch our clips, leave your comments on X and TikTok. Be the first to hear about upcoming events and special episodes. Make sure you subscribe to our mailing list at stormontsources.com. Okay, so just off with our interview with Paul Givan, the Education Minister. We were talking a wee bit, and we did touch upon there about potential for a collapse. He was pretty clear the DUP won't be collapsing the institutions, but yet I don't think that's going to quell about stability in the executive. He does acknowledge that things are tough. Tim, what do you make of the musings?
Well, it was good to
of
have a week where we had another unionist on, and I could sit back and listen to the cut and thrust of everything that was going on. It was really good.
You actually took time away from Paul Givan's interview time, just FYI there. So just to robustly challenge you two. I don't think he needed your help, but that's okay.
Well, look, I mean, Paul definitely didn't need my help. I thought he put, was very robust, and if that's a flavour of what we're going to get on Monday, I just think Paul, is going to perform well in that debate. I do think just on the debate and on the motion, I think the Assembly actually needs to be a bit more sleek with these things. I don't think there's any reason why the motion that's coming forward next week couldn't have been debated on Monday, because I just think that sort of toxic atmosphere now just hangs over the Assembly for another week where it doesn't really need to happen. I think you could have had that motion debated Monday afternoon. We could have had everything laid out on the floor on Monday instead of having an urgent question on Monday and then a motion the following week. There's just no need for that. The issues aren't going to change. The debate's not going to change. The optics aren't going to change. I think if we could have been a bit more sleek in and around the rules and the standing orders to have allowed that to happen on Monday. I think rather than just drag on, we could have dealt with, I think, with a lot of the toxicity and actually sucked that out of the situation a little better if we'd have been allowed to do that on Monday. Look, I think, the atmosphere clearly within the Assembly and clearly within the executive and clearly within this podcast as well is it's not as friendly, and it doesn't have as much bonhomie as what it had certainly at the beginning. And I think that's really what my question to Paul was about, was what is it about unionists right now that they're being held to a different standard by other parties than what other parties are being held to for doing largely the same things. And I think that's how unionists feel. Now, people can disagree. People can say unionism, brought this on themselves, as Michael put to Paul. Unionism has done things in the past, which is really this is them, self-inflicting. Which right, okay, that's the criticism. But undoubtedly within unionism, right now there is a feeling right across the piece, from moderate unionists right through to the other end, at other extremes of unionism, that enough is enough. Nationalism and republicanism has gone too far this time, and really there's a line in the sand that has been drawn.
Maybe can I just probe this, Tim, about gone too far? No nationalist forced Paul Givan to go to Israel. No one
Yes,
forced him to do it.
but
So what do you mean forced? What do you mean gone too far?
but when Paul led this out, I mean, maybe you didn't listen to him, and I think that's a difficulty. I don't think nationalists and Republicans are listening, because exactly the same thing
At
could
least
be
a
laid.
thousand are.
Well, that's right. And exactly the same thing could be laid at the door of the economy minister, who took a solo run, took a position on Israel-Palestine, a pro-Palestinian position against Israeli workforce, against Israeli companies, a position that she wasn't entitled to take, but yet nobody said anything about that. Michael's not outraged about that.
So you're saying it, and Paul Givan said it.
But I haven't read very much about that in the
if the
media.
DUP
Philip
want
Brett has
to
brought
pursue
forward
her, they're free to do so.
Philip Brett has brought forward a call-in into the executive.
Well,
for
then why are you saying
it's
it's different standards?
Because, well, I mean, we're not having massive debates in the floor of the Assembly. We're not having Nolan Show, Talk Back, Belltel podcast, Stormont Sources, all forcing its anger and its ire against one minister in the executive.
Can we just not to lift up the curtain too much, but Tim has not once suggested this as a topic for Stormont Sources, just FYI.
Not once suggested.
Not once have you suggested this as a topic for us to talk about.
Well, look, that's because we are very much reacting to what's going on around media outlets. And, maybe that's, I'm not a journalist.
You're feeling the unionist cause there.
Well, I'm not a journalist, David. You are. And of a fashion. We are reacting. I'm a commentator. I'm reacting and commenting on what the stories are that journalists are bringing forward. Journalism, Belfast Telegraph, BBC, UTV, Stormont Live, none of those, I don't think Stormont Live's anymore.
That's right, I went off there about 6 years ago.
Yeah, what do you call the UTV one?
View from Stormont.
The View from Stormont, sorry. We've got The View and The View from Stormont. I get confused. And, none of these programmes are bringing that forward. None of these programmes are debating that. But yet a unionist goes to Israel, does nothing wrong, visits a school in his capacity as education minister, as he's perfectly entitled to do.
Would you have gone, Tim? Would you have gone if you'd received the invite? Would you have gone?
Probably not, but for a number of reasons, although not political, because I don't really like being away from home. And
here's a better question: if you were his special advisor, and this comes to you, and as I'm sure Paul did. And we should declare an interest. Both of us know Paul's special advisor. But would you have said, yes, Minister?
I'd said, Paul, go if you want to go. Because I think there's something slightly different for Paul, probably.
That's some advice.
Minister, if you want to go, you go. Because I think Paul's in a slightly different position. We got into this yesterday in Talk Back a little bit with William Crawley. I've been boring you with this on WhatsApp. There is a religious dimension to this, and I've been boring David with this for a week now on WhatsApp.
Christ, no.
And I don't want to dwell on it, because Talk Back covered this on the show, and myself and William Crawley bored the nation on Tuesday with this. Yeah. But there is a religious aspect. Paul has a particular brand of evangelical Christianity that has a special place for Israel. And I think I would have said to the minister, I know personally that's part of your politics, and it's not just theological, it is political as well. And I think, from that perspective, it was right for Paul to do what he would have wanted to have done. And that's why he went, and that's what he did, and then he posted the stuff that he posted. He has done nothing wrong. Now, just because other people wouldn't do it, doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. Just because other people say, well, I would do something different, that doesn't mean that what he did was wrong. That means he made a different choice, which he's entitled to make. Not everybody, and this may be a shock for some people, not everybody needs to do the same thing. He's a minister in the executive, and he made a choice for himself.
Of course he's free to go. But I mean, it was a ridiculous decision on all their parts. He did
nothing wrong. He is held to a different standard. He is held to a different standard to other ministers. Why? Why Paul Givan?
Okay, God, I feel like Edwin Pete's here. Right,
oh,
Michael,
you're no Edwin.
Michael, thank you for that. Michael, just on that, did you hear anything from? I mean, you may have noticed, by the way, in this interview, Tim was quieter than he has been since we started this whole venture, and I was pretty quiet too. Because Michael, I know you feel really deeply. I feel deeply about it, but I know you feel especially deeply about it. Did Paul say anything in that interview that even moved you a tiny bit towards?
No. To be fair to Paul, I thought it was still he gave a very good account of himself. But No, he didn't, because you can go on about the terribleness of Hamas, and that's all justified. You can go on and on about it, etc., etc. But as we speak, the Israelis are still bombing these innocent people, and they've been at it for such a... I mean, it's just a moral question. And it amazes me that... That's why I say the Catholic Protestant thing. It amazes me that Christians can't see how wrong that is. Now, I'm not interested in chasing after Paul or the motion of no confidence or any of that stuff. As far as I'm concerned, with the mandatory coalition arrangements, that's just going to be a bit of a Punch and Judy show. And we on Stormont Sources should be more about providing a degree of insight and illumination, rather than just who's going to win the Punch and Judy show. It's just...
we can do a bit of that. Michael, come on. But in terms of then, Michael, I'll ask you then. So Tim's given a pretty pessimistic view, not just here, but on previous episodes. The likelihood of collapse, because I asked Paul about would it make it to May 2027, and obviously he gave the answer of, well, the DUP won't collapse it. I mean, if I was to ask Peter Robinson in 2012 or 2009, 10, I think I probably would have got an answer of no, it will make it full term. But Paul Givan didn't seem able to say that. So, what did you make?
Yeah. Well, I think he was right. The DUP won't bring it down. I don't think Sinn Féin will bring it down either. It's in none of their interests to bring it down unless one or other does it as part of a total election stunt near May 27, like in March or 27 or something like that, and manufactures a massive fallout to polarise the vote in their interest. But looking at it right now, they're going to run full term and they're not going to bring it down over this. Why would they bring it down over this? It's just a Punch and Judy show.
Well, we say full term. I mean, we should know it only did come back in February of 24.
I still go back to what I said in June. If anything's going to bring it down, it's not this. It's Irish language. This is another straw on the camel's back. The camel's back's not broken. And if anything's going to bring it down, it's going to be some issue around Irish language. It's going to be either Sinn Féin not thinking they're getting enough on Irish language, or the DUP thinking there's too much. That's the issue that's going to break this executive.
Okay.
If it's going to break now, and I'm not saying it's certain. I'm saying that is going to be the issue. That's where the wedge sits between the parties right now.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting to see how things go.
Well, what about your assessment, David? You asked Paul Givan out of 10. You said one that's going to have 10 at one.
If you were to ask me today, I think it's about 8 out of 10 that it
survives.
That it makes it.
Michael, what's your score out of 10?
9.
I mean, I would say I'd put it at a 6, maybe. So it's more likely than not. But I certainly don't think that it's very secure.
Well, you see, we're Irish nationalists, so we're more optimistic by nature. You've just proved that. Anyway, right?
Despite being downtrodden.
I know, despite being so oppressed.
We can't listen to your, downtroddenness anymore, Michael.
It's the last straw.
Our thanks to Paul Givan for coming on to talk. We do have an announcement, by the way. If you have enjoyed Stormont Sources today, guess what? We have a bonus podcast coming for you later this week. So on Friday, tomorrow, a bonus episode will be dropping into your feeds. We were speaking with Colin Davison and Mark Crothers about their new book, 12 Paintings. We go through a variety of different politicos that they have painted, some senior people, everyone from Bill Clinton right the way through to Queen Elizabeth. It was a really fascinating chat, so keep an eye out for that dropping into your feeds tomorrow. That's all we have time for this edition of Stormont Sources. We are, as of today, officially 18 months away from the next Assembly election, so the countdown is officially on.
And somebody wrote about that in the Irish News, I saw.
It did, which was available in the Irish News, which you can look up online.
And it's even closer to Christmas.
And closer to Christmas. I'll end the...
As we're recording and as you're listening, it'll be 49 days to Christmas.
49 days to Christmas. Okay, look, and I'll be able to end the podcast at some stage in the next 5 hours. Okay, that's all we have time for from Tim, Michael, and myself. Just remember, if you want to get in touch with us, you can send us a WhatsApp, 0333 404 6507. Remember, use the word Stormont. We have a few of them in there. We will get to those next week. Drop us an email, hello@stormontsources.com. But until tomorrow, that's all from Michael, Tim, and myself, and we'll see you then.